Hello, Algebra 2 Part 2. This is 813, which is solving quadratic equations by taking square roots. So, the square root of any number can be positive or negative. So, if you have the square root of 16, that can be positive or negative 4. So this sign right here, when you have a plus sign on top of a minus sign, you can think about that as plus or minus or positive or negative. And so when you write it like this, it actually means you have two solutions. This stands for two numbers. It stands for the positive 4 and it stands for the negative 4. Okay? And so the reason why this works out is because if we think about what would happen if we would square each of those numbers, if you take a positive 4 and square it, you get 16. And then if you take a negative 4 and square it, you also get a positive 16. So that's why that works. So there are some quadratic equations that are set up in such a way that we can solve them by taking square roots. And so the general steps to solving these is you want to get the x squared by itself. Now sometimes the x squared is locked up in parentheses, so you can't get it by itself. So then in that case, you get whatever part of the equation is squared, you get that by itself, and then you take the square roots of both sides, and then your answer is positive or negative. So it's really simple. So we'll jump right into the classwork. Okay? So a few of these to start off with are pretty quick and easy. So for example, y squared is 25. Well, the squared portion of this is just the y, and it's already by itself. So we can just go ahead and take the square root of both sides, and we'll get y is plus or minus 5. So that also, if you like, you can also write it y equals positive 5 or negative 5, okay? So it means both things. For number 2, we have v squared is negative 49. So we can take the square root of both sides, okay? So on the left, we'll get v. Now on the right, so whenever you take the square root of a negative, you have to pull your I out first. And then if we take the square root of 49, that's going to be 7. So we'll have plus or minus 7i. Okay? And so you always have to include that plus or minus, and that means you have two solutions. So you either include the plus or minus, or you just write out both solutions. Now, we're going to skip ahead to number 5. So number 5 looks a little different. Oh, sorry, this was number 4. I should have numbered that as number 4. So if we skip to number 5, we have s squared minus 1 is 0. So remember, to solve these, we want to get the squared portion by itself. So the squared portion here is the s squared, and I've got to get rid of this minus 1. So I'm going to add that to both sides, and then I have s squared equals 1. So then I can take the square root of both sides, and I get s is plus or minus 1. Okay? And then that's my answer, and I'm all done. Let's go on to number 7. So for number 7, we have z squared plus 25 is 0. So remember, we want to get the squared portion by itself. So that means I'm going to subtract 25. And so I have z squared is negative 25. So if I take the square root of both sides, okay, so on the left, the square root of z squared is just z. And then on the right, well, we've got to take our I out. So that's going to be I root 25. Okay, and so the square root of 25 is 5. And so we can say our answer is plus or minus 5i. Number 8, we have u squared minus 27 is 0. Okay, so we'll move the 27 over. And so now we have u squared equals 27. And so we can go ahead and take the square root of both sides. Now this one is a little different than all the other examples we've done so far, because 27 is not a perfect square. But we still would break it down. So square root of u squared is u. The largest perfect square inside of 27 is 9. So you can take that 27 and rewrite it as 9 times 3. And then if we take the square root of 9 and pull that on the outside, so we get a 3. And we have this other 3 that we have to leave inside. And then of course, we have to throw the plus or minus in front. So our answer is u is plus or minus 3 root 3. And then number 9 is similar to that. So for number 9, we have t squared plus 50 is 0. Okay? So first off, I want to move that 50 over. So I'm going to subtract 50 from both sides. So t squared is negative 50. And then we can take the square root of both sides. Okay, so I've got a negative on the inside, so I'm going to pull out my I. And then 50 I can rewrite as 25 times 2. And so the square root of 25 is 5, and we can pull that out. We can't do anything with the square root of 2, so we have to leave that on the inside. So I'm going to have t is plus or minus 5i, right, because I pulled the square root of 25 out. And then root 2, we leave that on the inside. Okay. Now, number 10 looks different because our x is locked up in parentheses and it's being added or subtracted to another number. So, for number 10, we have 2 times x plus 3, the whole thing squared, is 32. Okay? So, in this case, what we want to do is, we can't get the x by itself. Or, excuse me, we can't get the x squared by itself, but we want to get this whole chunk of parentheses that's squared by itself, because then we can take the square root of that and unlock the parentheses. So, to get the parentheses by themselves, I'm going to divide both sides by 2. So, I'll get x plus 3, the whole thing squared, is 16. And now, I can go ahead and take the square root of both sides. Okay? So when I take the square root of x plus 3, the whole thing squared, that's just going to give me an x plus 3, right? If you take the square root of anything squared, that gets rid of your square and your square root. And then the square root of 16 is plus or minus 4. Now the reason why this one is different is because when it's plus or minus 4, that means two things, so that means two answers we have to solve from. So from this, we're going to write two equations that we have to solve. So we get x plus 3 is a positive 4, and x plus 3 is a negative 4, and then we'll solve both of these. So subtract 3, x is going to be a positive 1, subtract 3, x is negative 7. So that's our answer there. Okay. So for number 11, we're going to have x minus 2, the whole thing squared, is 16. So we'll go ahead and take the square root of both sides. So the square root of x minus 2 squared, well, square root of a square just gets rid of it. So it's just going to be x minus 2, and the square root of 16 is plus or minus 4. So now we have to write two equations from that. So I'll have x minus 2 is a positive 4, and then x minus 2 is a negative 4. So on the left, I can add 2, and so I'll get x is 6. Okay, I can do the same thing on the right, but in this case, now I'm doing negative 4 plus 2, which is a negative 2. So my two answers there are 6 and negative 2. So for 16, I have r plus 1/2, the whole thing squared, is 1/4. Okay? So we'll go ahead and take the square root of both sides, right? The variable that we want to solve for is locked up in the parentheses that are squared, and so the only thing that we can do is to take the square root of everything. So the square root of something squared is just itself, so that's just going to be r plus 1/2. Now, the square root of 1/4, you could think about this as the square root of 1 over the square root of 4, right? So if you remember from chapter 7, when we have a square root over a fraction, we can divide that up into 2 separate square roots, one over each part of the fraction. And then we can take the square root of each part of the fraction separately. So this is going to give us a plus or minus, well, the square root of 1 is just 1, and then the square root of 4 is 2. So then from this, we can write 2 separate equations. So we can have r plus 1/2 is a positive 1/2, and r plus 1/2 is a negative 1/2. Okay, so on the left side, we'll solve for r. So subtract 1/2, subtract 1/2, r is going to be 0. And then on the right side, we can subtract 1/2, subtract 1/2, and r will be, well, negative 1/2 minus 1/2, that's going to give us a negative 1. So your 2 solutions are 0 and negative 1. For 17, we have v minus 5, the whole thing squared, plus 15 is 0. Okay, so we can subtract 15 from both sides, and now I have v minus 5, the whole thing squared, is negative 15. Let's go ahead and take the square root of both sides. Okay, so on the left, my square root is just going to be v minus 5, so I get rid of my parentheses and my square root. Now on the right, well, the square root of negative 15, well, 5 times 3 is the only thing that makes 15, and neither of those we can pull out of the square root. So the best we can do is just to write plus or minus I root 15. So for that, all we can really do is pull our I out and put a plus or minus in front of it. And then we will add 5 to both sides. So I'll get v is plus or minus I root 15 plus 5. Okay? Now, you could leave your answer like this, and it would partly be okay. But we really like to write our real number first. So what we really should do is say v is 5 plus or minus I root 15. And that's your answer to 17. So for number 19, in parentheses, we have x minus 1, the whole thing squared, minus 18 is 0. Okay? So we want to get the parentheses squared by itself. So we're going to add 18 to both sides. So then I have x minus 1, the whole thing squared, is a positive 18. We can take the square root of both sides. Okay? So the square root of x minus 1 squared is just going to be x minus 1. Now, root 18, well, we can break that down into 9 times 2. And so the square root of 9 is 3, and we can pull that out. We can't take the square root of 2, so we'll have to leave that in there. And because we took something out of the square root, well, that turns into a plus or minus, so we can throw that in front. And remember, we want to get the x by itself, so our last step is just to add 1 to both sides. So what we have is x is plus or minus 3 root 2 plus 1. And it's okay to leave your answer like this, but we would really like to have this 1 first. So this is going to turn into x is 1 plus or minus 3 root 2. Alright, let's go on to number 20. So now we have x minus 3/5, the whole thing squared, minus 75 is 0. Okay, so we'll add 75 to both sides, and I'll get x minus 3/5, the whole thing squared, is 75. So let's go ahead and take the square root of both sides. Okay, so on the left, that's going to turn into x minus 3/5. Now, on the right, the square root of 75, well, 75, we can break that into 25 times 3. And the square root of 25 is just 5, so I have x minus 3/5 equals plus or minus 5 root 3. Now we want to get the x by itself, so what we have to do is add 3/5 to both sides. So then I get x is plus or minus 5 root 3 plus 3/5. And you could leave it like that, but we really like to have our radicals at the end of the answer. So let's go ahead and reorder this and say it's 3/5 plus or minus 5 root 3. Alright, so that was 22. Sorry, not 20, but 22. Alright, let's go on to 23 and 24. Okay, so for 23, we're going to have u minus 1/3, the whole thing squared, minus 27 is 0. Okay, so we want to get the u minus 1/3 all by itself, so let's add 27 to both sides. So then I have u minus 1/3, the whole thing squared, is 27. So we can take the square root of both sides, and then we'll do the square root of 27. So on the left, well, that's just going to turn into u minus 1/3. On the right, the square root of 27, that turns into 9 times 3. Okay, so we have u minus 1/3. Now, the square root of 9, we can pull that out. That's just 3. The square root of 3, we can't do anything with that, so we'll leave that on the inside, and then we can throw a plus or minus in front of this. So we want to get the u by itself, so let's add 1/3 to both sides. Okay, so now I have u is plus or minus 3 root 3 plus 1/3. Okay, so u is plus or minus 3 root 3 plus 1/3. Well, we really like to write this with our radical at the end, so let's go ahead and call this 1/3 plus or minus 3 root 3. So I just switched the order on that. Okay, and that's the answer for 23. So for the last problem, we have 24. We're going to have x plus 1/2, the whole thing squared, minus 45 is 0. So we'll go ahead and add 45 to both sides. So I'm going to get x plus 1/2, the whole thing squared, is 45. And now we'll take the square root of both sides. Okay, so on the left, we will get x plus 1/2 all by itself. And then on the right, well, the square root of 45, we can break that down into the square root of 9 times 5. So I get x plus 1/2, and the square root of 9, we can pull that out, that's 3, and we'll throw a plus or minus in front of it. Now the 5 that's on the inside, we can't take the square root of 5, so we'll have to leave that inside the radical. So right here we have x plus 1/2 is plus or minus 3 root 5. So let's subtract 1/2 from both sides, and then we get x is plus or minus 3 root 5 minus 1/2. Okay, now remember, we'd really like to have our radical at the end and have our negative 1/2 first, so we can rewrite this as x is negative 1/2 plus or minus 3 root 5. And that's our answer, and we're all done. So that's the end of 813, and hopefully you've seen a variety of examples, enough examples that you can go ahead and try the homework on your own.